The moment Officer Maria Santos saw her canine partner Zeus collapse during the warehouse raid, she knew her world would never be the same. The German Shepherd had been shot protecting a group of hostages from armed drug dealers, and as Maria cradled his bleeding body in her arms, whispering promises that everything would be okay, she could see the light fading from his loyal brown eyes. Zeus had been more than a partner, he'd been her anchor through a bitter divorce, her companion through lonely nights, and the reason she'd found purpose again after nearly leaving the force. The veterinarian's words still echoed in her mind 3 weeks later. Zeus would live, but his injuries meant he could never work again, and worse, he seemed to have lost his spirit entirely, spending his days lying motionless in his kennel, refusing to acknowledge Maria's visits. Maria's captain had been patient, but the pressure was mounting for her to accept a new canine partner. The department had invested too much in her training to let her work regular patrol indefinitely. But every time she walked through the canine training facility, looking at the eager young dogs waiting for their chance to serve, Maria felt like she was betraying Zeus. How could she form that sacred bond with another animal when her heart was still breaking for the partner who'd literally taken a bullet meant for innocent people? The other officers tried to understand, but they hadn't spent 4 years learning to communicate without words, hadn't experienced the absolute trust that comes from knowing another being would die for you without hesitation. That's when she met Shadow, a 3-year-old Belgian Malinois with a reputation for being untrainable. Shadow had been through 4 different handlers in 2 years, each one returning him to the program with reports of aggression, disobedience, and an apparent inability to bond with humans. The dog's file read like a case study in behavioral problems. He'd been found as a puppy in a basement with 17 other dogs, all victims of an illegal breeding operation where animals were kept in cages barely large enough for them to stand. Shadow had trust issues that ran soul deep, and his previous handlers had given up on him, declaring him unsuitable for police work. If you believe in the power of second chances, in the healing that can happen when 2 broken souls find each other, and in the incredible loyalty that animals show us even when we don't deserve it, please hit that like button, leave a comment sharing your own story of animal companionship, share this video with someone who needs hope today, and subscribe to Pawsitive Tales. Your support helps us continue bringing you these powerful stories of resilience, love, and the bonds that change lives forever. Maria's first meeting with Shadow was a disaster. The dog cowered in the corner of his kennel, growling low whenever she approached, his dark eyes filled with a mixture of fear and defiance that reminded her painfully of her own reflection lately. She'd been going through the motions of life since Zeus's shooting, feeling disconnected from everyone around her, building walls to protect herself from caring too much ever again. When she tried to leash Shadow for their first training session, he snapped at her hand, not making contact, but sending a clear message that he wasn't ready to trust anyone. The other trainers shook their heads, suggesting she choose a different dog, one with a better temperament and higher success probability. But something about Shadow's wounded wariness spoke to Maria's own pain. She recognized the look in his eyes, the same guarded expression she saw in her bathroom mirror every morning, the same reluctance to let anyone close enough to cause more hurt. Against everyone's advice, she decided to take Shadow as her new partner, not because she thought it would be easy, but because she understood what it felt like to have everyone give up on you when you needed help the most. Their early training sessions were exercises in mutual stubbornness, with Shadow refusing commands and Maria struggling to find the patience she'd once had in abundance. The breakthrough came during their 4th week together, on what started as a routine patrol through the residential district on the outskirts of town. They'd been called to investigate reports of suspicious activity near Maple Street, a quiet neighborhood of older homes where nothing more exciting than package theft usually occurred. As they drove slowly down the tree-lined street, Shadow suddenly became alert in the back of the patrol car, his ears forward and his body tense with an energy Maria hadn't seen from him before. When they reached 1247 Maple Street, a modest 2-story house with peeling paint and an overgrown yard, Shadow began whining and pawing at the car window with an urgency that made Maria's police instincts kick in. The house belonged to Eleanor Wright, an 87-year-old widow who'd lived there for 60 years. Maria had driven past it hundreds of times but had never paid much attention to the property or its reclusive owner. Neighbors occasionally mentioned that Mrs. Wright kept to herself, that they rarely saw her outside, and that her late husband had been some kind of engineer who'd worked for the city before retiring. But Shadow's reaction was so intense, so focused, that Maria decided to investigate. She parked the car and approached the front door, with Shadow straining against his leash, not with aggression but with what seemed like desperate concern. Maria knocked on the front door and waited, but no answer came. She could hear movement inside, a shuffling sound followed by what might have been a muffled cry for help. Shadow was pulling toward the back of the house now, his behavior becoming more frantic by the minute. Using her authority as a police officer conducting a welfare check, Maria made her way to the backyard, where she discovered an unlocked door leading into what appeared to be a converted garage. Shadow immediately pushed past her and disappeared into the dim interior, his whining growing more intense. What Maria found inside that converted garage would haunt her dreams for months, but not for the reasons she initially feared. The space had been transformed into a makeshift medical facility, complete with examination tables, surgical equipment, and rows of recovery kennels along the walls. But these weren't for human patients. Eleanor Wright had been operating an underground veterinary clinic for abandoned and injured animals for over 15 years, using her late husband's engineering pension to fund operations for creatures that couldn't afford proper medical care. The walls were lined with before and after photographs of dogs, cats, birds, and even wild animals she'd nursed back to health. Mrs. Wright herself was lying on the floor near one of the examination tables, conscious but unable to get up after falling while treating an injured stray dog. She'd been there for nearly 6 hours, too weak to call for help but still managing to talk soothingly to the frightened animals in the kennels around her. Shadow went directly to her side, not as a trained police dog responding to commands, but as one wounded soul recognizing another's pain. He lay down beside the elderly woman and began licking her hand gently, offering comfort in the only way he knew how. As Maria called for medical assistance, Mrs. Wright explained her situation through labored breaths. She'd been a veterinary nurse before marriage and had continued studying veterinary medicine through correspondence courses over the decades. When her husband died 5 years earlier, she'd used their savings to create this sanctuary for animals that had been given up on by everyone else. She performed surgeries that other clinics deemed too risky or expensive, took in animals that shelters couldn't save, and provided end-of-life comfort for pets whose owners couldn't afford euthanasia at a veterinary office. She'd been working alone all these years, driven by a belief that every creature deserved a chance at healing and dignity. The paramedics arrived within minutes, but Mrs. Wright refused to leave until she was sure her current patients would be cared for. Maria found herself volunteering to stay with the animals until Mrs. Wright could return, and as she looked around at the dozens of recovery cases, dogs missing limbs learning to walk again, cats recovering from abuse, birds with mended wings, she began to understand why Shadow had led her here. This wasn't just about an injured woman needing help, it was about finding a place where broken things could heal, where beings that had been written off could discover their worth again. Over the following weeks, as Mrs. Wright recovered in the hospital, Maria found herself spending all her off-duty time at the makeshift clinic. Shadow transformed before her eyes, becoming gentle and nurturing with the injured animals, somehow understanding which ones needed space and which ones craved companionship. His own trauma seemed to make him particularly effective at calming frightened creatures, and Maria watched in amazement as the dog she'd been told was untrainable began exhibiting the exact qualities that make exceptional therapy animals. Maria's relationship with Shadow deepened as they worked together to care for Mrs. Wright's patients. She began to understand that his previous behavioral problems hadn't been about aggression or inability to learn, they'd been about a complete lack of trust in humans, based on early experiences that had taught him that people were sources of pain rather than comfort. But in this environment, surrounded by other wounded creatures and guided by Maria's newfound patience, Shadow began to reveal his true nature, gentle, intuitive, and possessed of an almost supernatural ability to sense emotional pain in others. When Mrs. Wright was released from the hospital, she was amazed to find her clinic running more smoothly than ever. Maria had organized a network of veterinary students and retired professionals to volunteer their time, local pet stores had begun donating supplies, and word of the underground sanctuary had spread through social media, bringing both support and scrutiny. Maria helped Mrs. Wright navigate the legal requirements to legitimize her operation, working with city officials to obtain proper permits and licenses for what would become the Wright Animal Recovery Center. Shadow's transformation was complete by then, but it wasn't the transformation anyone had expected. Rather than becoming a traditional police canine, he'd evolved into something more valuable, a therapy dog capable of providing emotional support to both animals and humans in crisis. Maria petitioned the department to create a new position for Shadow as a crisis response animal, arguing that his unique abilities were exactly what the community needed. The program was approved, and Shadow became the first official therapy dog in the department's history, responding to situations involving trauma, loss, and emotional distress, 6 months after that life-changing day on Maple Street, Maria visited Zeus at the rehabilitation facility where he was learning to adjust to retirement. To her amazement, Zeus seemed happier and more alert than she'd seen him since the shooting. The facility's director explained that Zeus had been working with their animal therapy program, helping other injured animals adjust to their new limitations. Zeus had found his own second chance at purpose, not as a police dog but as a healer for other wounded creatures. The ripple effects of that single moment when Shadow stopped at Mrs. Wright's house continued to spread throughout the community. The Wright Animal Recovery Center became a model for other cities, showing how public-private partnerships could address animal welfare issues more effectively than traditional approaches. Shadow's story inspired the creation of therapy dog programs in schools, hospitals, and crisis centers across the region. Most importantly, Maria had rediscovered her own capacity for hope and healing, learning that sometimes the most broken things can become the most beautiful when they're given the chance to serve a purpose larger than their own pain. If this story touched your heart, if it reminded you that our greatest struggles can become our greatest strengths, and if you believe in the transformative power of giving second chances to those who need them most, please give this video a thumbs up, share it with someone who might need inspiration today, and let us know in the comments how this story made you feel. Your engagement helps us continue sharing these powerful stories of resilience, hope, and the incredible bonds that heal us all. What's the most profound way an animal has changed your perspective on life, healing, or second chances? Share your story in the comments below. Your experience might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today to believe that broken doesn't mean worthless, and that sometimes our deepest wounds can become our greatest sources of compassion and strength.